Before we begin this incredible true story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another amazing story like this one. Now, let's dive into what happened that day. The summer sun blazed over the historic palace grounds as tourists gathered in the main courtyard. Among the crowd stood Marcus Chen, 32-year-old businessman from California, who had traveled across the world to experience the famous changing of the guard ceremony. He wore expensive sunglasses, designer clothes, and carried an air of entitlement that seemed to radiate from every pore. Marcus had built his wealth quickly through a tech startup, and the rapid success had inflated his ego to dangerous proportions. He believed money could buy anything, including respect and special treatment. His social media accounts were filled with photos of him breaking rules, getting into restricted areas, and bragging about how his wealth made him untouchable. Standing beside the velvet ropes that separated tourists from the ceremonial guards, Marcus grew impatient. He wanted the perfect selfie, the kind that would get thousands of likes on his social media. The problem was that the angle wasn't quite right from where tourists were supposed to stand. The guards, in their pristine uniforms and stoic expressions, stood just a few feet away, and Marcus decided they would make the perfect backdrop for his photo. The royal guards were specially trained soldiers who took their duty seriously. They represented centuries of tradition and discipline. Among them was James Mitchell, a 28-year-old guard who had served for 6 years. James came from a humble background, the son of a factory worker and a nurse. He had joined the military to serve his country and provide for his younger siblings after their father passed away. Every day he stood at his post with pride. Knowing that his uniform represented something greater than himself, Marcus ducked under the velvet rope. Ignoring the immediate protests from nearby security personnel and tourists, he strutted toward James with his phone held high, completely disregarding the clear boundaries that had been established. Other tourists gasped and whispered among themselves, shocked at the blatant disrespect being displayed. James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as his training demanded. He had dealt with disrespectful tourists before, but he maintained his composure. The role of a ceremonial guard required absolute discipline, no matter what happened around them. Marcus positioned himself right next to James, barely inches away. He made faces, posed dramatically, and took several selfies. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence. Some tourists began filming the incident, sensing that something was about to go very wrong. Security guards started moving toward Marcus, but he was so focused on getting his perfect shot that he didn't notice. Growing frustrated that the guard wouldn't react or look at the camera, Marcus decided to escalate the situation. He reached out and poked James in the shoulder, trying to get a reaction. James didn't move. Marcus poked him again, harder this time. Still, James maintained his position, though a slight tension appeared in his jaw. The crowd began to murmur louder now. Children pointed while their parents pulled them back. An elderly woman shook her head in disgust. Several people called out to Marcus to stop, to show some respect, but he ignored them all. To him, these warnings were just noise from people who didn't understand that rules didn't apply to someone like him. Marcus made the worst decision of his life. Frustrated by the guard's lack of response and feeling disrespected himself, he pulled back his fist and punched James directly in the chest. The sound of the impact echoed across the courtyard. The crowd gasped in collective horror. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. James stumbled back slightly from the force of the blow.
Ow!
But years of training kept him from falling. His face remained controlled, though pain flashed briefly in his eyes. Other guards immediately snapped to attention, and security personnel rushed forward. Marcus stood there with a smirk on his face, apparently proud of himself for finally getting a reaction. What? Marcus didn't know was that dozens of cameras had captured every second of his assault. Tourist phones, security cameras, and even a news crew that happened to be filming a segment about the palace had recorded everything. Within minutes, those videos would begin spreading across the internet at an incredible speed. Security guards surrounded Marcus within seconds. His smirk began to fade as he realized he was being detained. He tried to laugh it off, pulling out his phone to show them his social media following. as if that would somehow make everything okay. The security team wasn't impressed. They had seen entitled tourists before. Physically assaulting a guard crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Marcus began to argue, his voice rising as he insisted they couldn't treat him this way. He threatened lawsuits and claimed he had important connections. The crowd watched as he was escorted away, many of them still recording. Some applauded the security team. Others just stood in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. James remained at his post, though a supervisor quickly came to check on him. He assured them he was fine and insisted on finishing his shift. That was the kind of man James was. Dedicated, professional, and unwilling to let someone like Marcus disrupt his duty. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and returned to his position as if nothing had happened, as Marcus was led away to a security office. He had no idea that his life was about to change dramatically. The videos of his assault were already being uploaded to social media platforms. Within an hour, they would be viewed by millions. The karma that was coming for Marcus would be swift, brutal, and absolutely devastating. His arrogance had finally caught up with him, and the whole world was about to watch him fall. Inside the palace security office, Marcus sat in a hard plastic chair with his arms crossed. He still hadn't grasped the severity of what he had done. To him, this was just an inconvenience, a minor setback that his money and influence would quickly resolve. He tapped his expensive watch impatiently and demanded to speak with someone in charge. The security supervisor, a stern woman named Patricia Holmes who had worked at the palace for 15 years, sat across from him with a folder containing printed images from the security footage. She looked at Marcus with an expression of controlled disgust. In all her years, she had dealt with pickpockets, protesters, and unruly tourists. But she had never seen someone assault a guard so brazenly. Marcus tried to charm his way out of the situation. He explained that he was an important businessman, that this was all just a misunderstanding, that he got carried away trying to get a good photo. He offered to make a donation to whatever charity the palace supported. He even suggested that the guard had provoked him by not responding to his friendly gestures. Each excuse made Patricia's expression harder, Patricia informed Marcus that assaulting a royal guard was a serious criminal offense. The guard he had struck was not just a ceremonial figure but an active duty soldier. Marcus had committed assault on military personnel while they were performing their duties. The charges could include assault, trespassing in a restricted area, and disturbing a ceremonial function. Marcus's face finally began to pale as the reality started to sink in. Outside the security office, something extraordinary was happening. The videos of Marcus punching the guard had exploded across social media. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook were flooded with the footage. People from around the world were commenting, sharing, and expressing their outrage. The hashtag that emerged organically was brutal and direct, calling out Marcus by name and demanding justice. A technology. Journalist in London was among the first to dig deeper into Marcus's background. Within an hour of the video going viral, she had connected the assault to Marcus's social media profiles. His accounts were public, filled with posts bragging about his wealth and showing him disrespecting rules and people in various locations around the world. There were photos of him climbing barriers at historical sites, ignoring no-entry signs, and making rude gestures at service workers. The journalist compiled everything into a thread that went even more viral than the original video. People were horrified not just by the assault on the guard, but by the pattern of entitled behavior Marcus had displayed for years. His social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. His follower count, which he had been so proud of, began dropping rapidly as people unfollowed and blocked him. Back at the security office, Marcos's phone began buzzing constantly. At first, he assumed it was concerned friends and family, or maybe even fans supporting him. Patricia allowed him to check his phone, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Notification after notification flooded his screen. Tags, mentions, shares, and comments, all of them negative. The video had spread everywhere. Marcus tried to open his social media apps to do damage control, but the sheer volume of activity made them barely functional. His hands trembled as he scrolled through comment after comment, calling him a disgrace, demanding he face consequences, and celebrating his downfall. Some people had already identified his company and were calling for boycotts. Others were sharing the video with major news outlets and demanding coverage. His business phone started ringing. It was his business partner, Sarah, and her voice was panicked. Their company's social media accounts were being bombarded with angry messages. Clients were calling to cancel contracts. Investors were demanding emergency meetings. The company's reputation, which they had spent years building, was crumbling in real time because of Marcus's 15 seconds of arrogance. Sarah was furious. She had warned Marcus countless times about his behavior, about the way he treated people, about his social media posts that showed him acting superior to everyone around him. Now their entire business was paying the price for his actions. She informed him that the board would be meeting that evening to discuss removing him from his position. Marcus tried to argue, but Sarah hung up on him. The major news networks had picked up the story within 2 hours of the incident. CNN, BBC, and networks around the world were running segments about the assault. They showed the video, discussed the seriousness of assaulting military personnel, and interviewed experts on tourism etiquette and legal consequences. Marcus's face was broadcast to millions of viewers worldwide, not as the successful businessman he imagined himself to be, but as an example of entitled tourist behavior gone wrong. James, the guard Marcus had assaulted, was back at the barracks after his shift ended. His commanding officer had insisted he go to the medical unit for a checkup, though James maintained he was fine. The punch had left a bruise, but nothing more serious. What bothered James more than the physical pain was the disrespect to his uniform and what it represented. The other guards rallied around James, expressing their support and anger at what had happened. Messages of support were already pouring in from military communities around the world. Veterans and active-duty soldiers were praising James for his restraint and professionalism. A fund had been spontaneously started by military support organizations to show appreciation for James's service and dignity under assault. Meanwhile, local police arrived at the palace to formally arrest Marcus. Patricia had provided them with all the evidence they needed: multiple video angles, witness statements from dozens of tourists, and security footage that clearly showed Marcus ducking under the barrier, approaching the guard, and delivering the punch. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretations. Marcus had committed assault in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple cameras, as the police read Marcus's rights. The full weight of his actions finally crashed down on him. This wasn't going to be resolved with money or connections. He had assaulted a military guard in a foreign country, on camera, with hundreds of witnesses. His name and face were now known to millions of people around the world, and not in the way he had always dreamed. He was famous, but as a villain, as an example of everything wrong with entitled tourists. The police escorted Marcus out through a side entrance, to avoid the media that had already gathered at the main gates. But it didn't matter. Photos of him being led away in handcuffs were taken by palace security cameras and would eventually be released to the press. The karma Marcus had earned was swift and devastating, but it was only just beginning. The legal consequences, professional fallout, social destruction were all still unfolding, and they would prove to be far worse than he could have ever imagined. The police station was nothing like what Marcus had expected. In his mind, he had imagined being taken to a comfortable room where lawyers would quickly sort everything out, and he would be released with maybe a fine. Instead, he found himself being processed like any other criminal, fingerprinted and photographed, with his personal belongings taken and cataloged. The reality of his situation was becoming impossible to deny. His phone, now in an evidence bag, continued to buzz with notifications. The police allowed him one call, and Marcus immediately contacted his lawyer back in California. Richard Barnes had handled Marcus's business legal matters for years, dealing with contracts and corporate issues. He had never handled a criminal case, especially not an international incident involving assault on military personnel. Richard listened to Marcus's panicked explanation of events, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice carefully controlled. He told Marcus that he was out of his depth with this kind of case, and that Marcus needed a criminal defense attorney who understood international law. More importantly, Richard suggested that Marcus prepare himself for serious consequences. This wasn't a situation that money could easily fix. After the call ended, Marcus sat alone in a holding cell. The concrete walls and metal bench were a far cry from his luxury apartment and five-star hotels. For the first time in years, Marcus had no control over his situation. He couldn't buy his way out, couldn't charm anyone, couldn't use his social media influence to change the narrative. He was just another person who had broken the law. And the system was treating him exactly as such. While Marcus sat in his cell, the internet had become completely consumed with his story. The video had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms within 12 hours. It had sparked countless discussions about tourist behavior, privilege, entitlement, and respect for other cultures. Think pieces were being written. Podcasts were dedicating entire episodes to analyzing what had happened. Marcus had become the face of everything people hated about entitled tourists. His company was in free fall. The emergency board meeting that Sarah had mentioned had concluded with a unanimous decision to remove Marcus from all positions of authority. A press release was issued stating that the company condemned Marcus's actions and that he no longer represented the organization in any capacity. His shares would be bought out according to their partnership agreement, but at a price far lower than their peak value because the company's stock had plummeted. Clients were terminating contracts faster than the company could process the paperwork. A major tech firm that had been their biggest account released a statement saying they could not be associated with someone who displayed such disrespect and violence. Other clients followed immediately, not wanting to be seen as supporting Marcus or his behavior. The company that Marcus had built was surviving, but only by completely severing ties with him. Marcus's social media accounts, once his pride and joy, had become monuments to his downfall. His follower count had dropped by over 80%. The remaining followers were mostly people who had stuck around to leave angry comments or watch his destruction unfold. Every post he had ever made was being scrutinized and criticized. Old photos of him acting entitled were being shared as evidence of a long pattern of terrible behavior. Someone had created a compilation video of all Marcus's worst social media moments, set to music, showing him being rude to service workers, ignoring rules at various locations, and generally acting like he was above everyone else. That video had gone viral too, accumulating millions of views and further cementing his reputation as someone who had finally faced consequences for years of bad behavior. Back at the palace, James had become an unexpected hero. Military organizations were praising his restraint and professionalism. The fund that had been started to support him had raised over $200,000 from people around the world who wanted to show appreciation for his dignity under assault. James was overwhelmed by the support and insisted that any money raised should go to military family charities rather than to him personally. The palace released an official statement commending James for his exemplary conduct and condemning the assault. They announced that they would be pursuing full legal action against Marcus and that security measures would be reviewed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The statement was widely praised for its firm stance on protecting the guards who served with such dedication. James gave one interview to a military publication, carefully speaking about the incident. He explained that his training had prepared him for challenging situations, and that maintaining composure was part of his duty. He expressed that he bore no personal ill will toward Marcus, but hoped the incident would remind tourists to respect the people and traditions of the places they visit. His words were measured, dignified, and made him even more admired. Meanwhile, his parents in California were dealing with their own nightmare. The media had tracked them down, and reporters were camped outside their modest home. Marcus's father, a retired teacher, and his mother, who worked as a librarian, were horrified by their son's actions. They released a brief statement saying they were ashamed of Marcus's behavior and supported whatever legal consequences he faced. The statement was heartbreaking in its honesty and clearly showed where Marcus had gone wrong despite his upbringing. Marcus's younger sister, Emily, who was studying to be a nurse, found herself fielding questions from friends and classmates about her brother. She had always been embarrassed by Marcus's behavior and his obsession with wealth and status. Now that embarrassment had turned to shame. She posted on her own social media that she loved her brother, but did not support his actions and hoped he would learn from this experience. Her post was widely shared and praised for its courage. In the holding cell, Marcus finally had time to reflect on his choices. The bravado and arrogance that had carried him through the day were crumbling. He thought about the guard's face, the moment of pain that had flashed in his eyes when the punch landed. He thought about all the people he had been rude to over the years, all the times he had used his wealth as an excuse to treat others as inferior. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: genuine shame. A court-appointed lawyer arrived to discuss Marcus's case. The lawyer was blunt about the situation. Marcus was facing serious charges in a foreign country where he had no special protections or privileges. The video evidence was overwhelming. There were hundreds of witnesses. The case was being watched by millions of people around the world, which meant the court would be under pressure to make an example of him. The best outcome Marcus could hope for was a guilty plea, cooperation with authorities. In a demonstration of genuine remorse, Marcus asked about bail, about when he could leave, about how to make this go away. The lawyer shook his head. This wasn't going away. Marcus would likely be in custody until his trial, which could take weeks or even months to schedule. He would face significant fines, possible jail time, and deportation. Even after serving any sentence, he would carry a criminal record for assault on military personnel. His life as he had known it was over. As night fell on the police station, Marcus lay on the hard bench in his cell and realized that karma had indeed caught up with him. The viral video that had destroyed his reputation was being watched by more people than had ever seen his social media posts. He was famous, but as a cautionary tale about pride, entitlement, and the consequences of treating others with disrespect. The morning after his arrest, Marcus woke to the sound of cell doors opening and closing. His body ached from sleeping on the hard bench, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight of his situation. A guard brought him a tray with basic breakfast and informed him that his court appearance would be that afternoon. Marcus barely touched the food. His appetite had vanished along with his former life in California. Marcus's former business partner Sarah was doing damage control. She had spent the entire night in emergency meetings with the remaining board members and their crisis management team. The company had been rebranded overnight, removing any trace of Marcus's involvement. Their website was updated, their social media bios changed, and press releases sent to every major outlet clarifying that Marcus no longer had any connection to the organization. Sarah felt a mixture of anger and sadness. She had co-founded the company with Marcus when they were both young and ambitious. Back then, Marcus had been different. Or maybe she had just been too focused on success to notice the warning signs. Over the years, as money poured in, Marcus had changed. The humble young man who once worked 80-hour weeks had transformed into someone who believed his wealth made him superior to others. The morning news? Programs were still covering the story extensively. Legal experts were brought in to discuss the potential consequences Marcus faced. Cultural commentators talked about the rise of entitled tourist behavior and how social media had created a culture where people felt they needed to capture extreme moments for likes and views, regardless of who they hurt in the process. One particularly viral segment featured a retired military officer who spoke about the significance of ceremonial guards. He explained that these soldiers underwent rigorous training and served with honor. They represented their country and its values while standing their posts. He emphasized that assaulting a guard wasn't just attacking one person, but disrespecting an entire institution and the sacrifices of all who served. His emotional speech was shared millions of times and further turned public opinion against Marcus. James returned to duty that morning despite having the option to take time off. His commanding officer had made it clear that no one would judge him for needing a break after such a public incident. But James insisted on working. For him, letting Marcus's actions change his routine would be giving the assault more power than it deserved. He stood at his post with the same dignity and professionalism he had always shown. Tourists who came to the palace that day were noticeably more respectful. Many of them had seen the viral video and were conscious of maintaining proper distance and behavior. Parents used the incident as a teaching moment for their children, explaining why it was important to respect people who were working and to honor the rules of places they visited. In a strange way, Marcus's terrible decision had made people more aware of their own behavior. Marcus was transported to court in the early afternoon. He wore the same clothes from the day before, now wrinkled and stained. The transformation from the confident, well-dressed businessman in the video to the disheveled man in handcuffs was stark. News cameras captured his arrival, and those images would circulate widely. Showing the dramatic fall from grace, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had managed to get seats. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness but firmness, reviewed the case files as Marcus stood before her. His court-appointed lawyer stood beside him. Having prepared Marcus for what was about to happen, the prosecutor presented the charges: assault on a military officer performing ceremonial duties, trespassing in a restricted area, and disturbing a protected cultural ceremony. The evidence was overwhelming. Video from multiple angles showed every moment of the incident. Written statements from dozens of witnesses corroborated exactly what had happened. Even Marcus's own social media posts were presented as evidence of a pattern of disrespectful behavior. The prosecutor emphasized that this case had drawn international attention and that the court had a responsibility to send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Tourists were welcome and celebrated, but they had to respect local laws, traditions, and the people who serve their country. The prosecutor requested that Marcus be held without bail until trial and that the court consider the maximum fees allowed by law. Marcus's lawyer attempted to argue for bail, citing his client's lack of prior criminal record and his business ties. But the judge was unmoved. She noted that Marcus had substantial financial resources and no ties to the country, making him a significant flight risk. She also pointed out that the international attention on the case meant that releasing Marcus could be seen as giving preferential treatment to a wealthy foreigner. Bail was denied. Marcus would remain in custody until his trial, which was scheduled for 6 weeks later. The courtroom gasped at the decision. Marcus felt his legs weaken, and his lawyer had to steady him. 6 weeks in jail, awaiting trial. The reality was crushing. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs as cameras flashed and journalists shouted questions he wasn't allowed to answer. Social media exploded with reactions to the bail denial. Most people celebrated the decision, seeing it as justice being served regardless of Marcus's wealth. Some argued that 6 weeks was too lenient and that he deserved much more. A few sympathetic voices suggested that the punishment was becoming disproportionate to the crime, but they were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming majority who felt Marcus was finally facing appropriate consequences. Marcus's parents watched the court proceedings on television from their living room, tears streaming down their faces. They had raised their son to be better than this. His father thought about all the times he had tried to teach Marcus about humility and respect. His mother wondered where they had gone wrong, how their son had become someone capable of such thoughtless violence. Emily, Marcus's sister, sat in her college dorm room watching the same coverage. Her roommate awkwardly tried to offer comfort, but Emily just felt numb. She loved her brother, but she didn't recognize the person she had seen in that video. The Marcus she had grown up with had been kind and funny. When had he changed? Or had he always had this capacity for cruelty, and success had simply brought it to the surface? Back in jail, Marcus was processed into the general population. His cell was small, with a bunk bed, a metal toilet, and little else. His cellmate was a man awaiting trial on theft charges, who recognized Marcus immediately from the viral video. The man's cold stare made it clear that even among criminals, Marcus's actions were considered contemptible. Assaulting a soldier who couldn't defend himself was seen as cowardly. The first night in jail was the longest of Marcus's life. Every sound made him jump. The smell, the cold, the complete lack of privacy, it was all overwhelming. He thought about his luxury apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture. He thought about his expensive car, and his closet full of designer clothes. All of it seemed meaningless now. Marcus pulled out a piece of paper and a stubby pencil that had been provided. He began to write a letter to James, the guard he had assaulted. The words came slowly at first, then faster as emotions he had suppressed began to surface. He apologized for the assault, for the disrespect, for letting his ego turn him into someone capable of violence. He acknowledged that no apology could undo what he had done, but hoped that James knew he was genuinely sorry. Whether James would ever receive or read the letter, Marcus didn't know. But writing it felt like the first honest thing he had done in years. As he lay on his thin mattress that night, staring at the ceiling of his cell, Marcus understood that karma hadn't just caught up with him. It had completely dismantled the false life he had built on arrogance and entitlement. And now he would have to face who he really was beneath all the wealth and status. The weeks in jail changed Marcus in ways he never expected. The routine was strict and unchanging. Wake up at 6, breakfast at 7, 1 hour of recreation time, lunch at noon, and dinner at 5. The rest of the time was spent in his cell, with nothing but his thoughts and the growing realization of how badly he had lived his life before this moment. Marcus's cellmate, Derek, eventually began talking to him. Derek had been arrested for stealing to support his family after losing his job. Unlike Marcus, who had thrown away everything through his own arrogance, Derek was genuinely trying to survive in difficult circumstances. Listening to Derek's story humbled Marcus in ways nothing else could. Here was a man who had actually struggled, who had faced real hardship. And Marcus had never known anything like it, despite thinking he was. Somehow superior to everyone, the legal proceedings continued. Marcus's lawyer, who he had now replaced with a more experienced criminal defense attorney named Catherine Morrison, worked to prepare his case. Catherine was brutally honest with Marcus from their first meeting. She told him that his best chance at a reduced sentence was to plead guilty, show genuine remorse, and hope the judge would see that he was capable of change. Catherine also advised Marcus to write formal apologies, not just to James but to the palace, the military, and the people he had offended. She warned him that these letters would likely be made public and scrutinized for sincerity. If they seemed calculated or insincere, they would only make things worse. Marcus spent days writing and rewriting his apologies, trying to find words that expressed the genuine shame and regret he now felt. The international attention on the case hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger. Marcus had become a symbol in discussions about privilege, entitlement, and consequences. Universities were using his case in classes about ethics and social media responsibility. His story was being studied as an example of how quickly someone could destroy their entire life through a single moment of arrogance. Meanwhile, James's life had taken an unexpectedly positive turn. The fund raised in his name had grown to over $500,000, all of which he directed to military family support charities. He was invited to speak at veteran events about discipline and professionalism under pressure. James handled the attention with the same humility he showed in everything else, always redirecting praise to his fellow service members and the values of duty and honor. A documentary film crew approached James about telling his story, but he politely declined. He didn't want to profit from the incident or turn it into entertainment. For James, the assault was something he had endured in the line of duty, nothing more. He had no desire for revenge against Marcus or interest in prolonging the public spectacle. He simply wanted to continue serving with honor. Back in California, the ripple effects of Marcus's actions continued. His former company had stabilized under Sarah's leadership, but they had lost nearly 40% of their value. Some clients had returned after seeing the company's decisive action in removing Marcus, but others were gone permanently. Sarah worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and reputation, all while dealing with her own complicated feelings about her former friend and partner. Marcus's parents received the letter he had written to James, which they agreed to forward to the palace. They also received letters Marcus wrote to them, filled with apologies and reflections on how he had taken their love and support for granted. His mother cried reading his words. Recognizing glimpses of the son she thought she had lost to wealth and ego. Emily visited Marcus once during his time in jail. The visit was awkward and painful. Marcus looked terrible, thinner and exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. They sat on opposite sides of a plexiglass barrier, communicating through phones. Emily told him honestly that she was angry at him, embarrassed by what he had done, but still loved him as her brother. She said she hoped this experience would change him, because the person in that viral video wasn't someone she recognized or wanted in her life. Marcus broke down during that visit. He apologized to Emily for embarrassing the family, for all the times he had acted superior around her friends, for making everything about his money and success. Emily listened, her own eyes wet with tears, and told him that apologies were just words. What mattered was whether he would actually change, whether he could become a better person after this. The trial date finally arrived. Marcus had lost weight, and his expensive clothes from weeks ago now hung loosely on his frame. Catherine had arranged for him to wear a simple suit to court, wanting him to appear humble and remorseful rather than wealthy and arrogant. As Marcus was transported to the courthouse, he saw protesters outside holding signs, demanding justice for James. The courtroom was even more packed than during the bail hearing. News organizations from around the world had sent reporters. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Marcus felt his heart pounding so hard, he thought it might burst from his chest. Catherine squeezed his arm reassuringly as they sat down. The prosecutor presented the case methodically, showing the videos, reading witness statements, and painting a picture of a man whose wealth and privilege had made him believe rules didn't apply to him. Every piece of evidence was damning. Marcus watched himself on the screen punching James, and shame washed over him. How had he become that person? When it was the defense's turn, Catherine called Marcus to the stand. This was risky, but they had decided it was necessary for Marcus to speak for himself. He took the oath and sat down, his hands trembling. Catherine asked him to describe what had happened that day. And Marcus told the truth about his arrogance, his entitlement, and his complete disregard for James as a person. Then Catherine asked the crucial question, had Marcus changed? Marcus looked directly at the judge and spoke from his heart. He talked about his weeks in jail, about learning humility from a cellmate who had real problems. He spoke about the letters from his sister and parents, about finally understanding that his wealth had isolated him from basic human decency. He acknowledged that no apology could undo what he had done, but he promised that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be better. The prosecutor cross-examined Marcus aggressively, questioning whether his remorse was genuine or just a performance to reduce his sentence. Marcus admitted that he couldn't prove his sincerity with words alone, that only his future actions would show whether he had truly changed. He accepted full responsibility for his actions and stated clearly that he deserved to be punished. After closing arguments, the judge called for a recess to consider her verdict. Marcus sat in a holding area with Catherine, waiting. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, they were called back into the courtroom. The judge looked at Marcus with an expression that was stern but not unkind. She spoke about the seriousness of his crime, about the disrespect shown to James and the military he represented. She noted the international attention the case had received and her responsibility to ensure justice was served fairly. She acknowledged Marcus's apparent remorse, but emphasized that remorse without consequences was meaningless. The judge delivered her verdict. Marcus was found guilty on all charges. The sentence was 4 months in jail, with credit for the 6 weeks already served, followed by 2 years of probation. He would also pay a substantial fine of $50,000, half of which would go to military family charities. Additionally, Marcus was banned from entering the country for 10 years after completing his sentence. Upon release, he'd be immediately deported back to the United States. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as the sentence was read. 4 months in jail. It could have been much worse, but it was still devastating. Catherine had warned him this was a likely outcome. The judge was being somewhat lenient, given his apparent remorse and lack of prior criminal record. But she was also sending a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated, as Marcus was led from the courtroom. He looked back at the gallery and saw his parents sitting in the back row. His mother was crying, and his father's face was etched with disappointment and pain. Emily sat beside them, her expression unreadable. Marcus mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," to them before being taken through the door back to jail. The news of the verdict spread instantly. Social media erupted with mixed reactions. Many people felt the sentence was appropriate, fair punishment that acknowledged both the seriousness of the crime and Marcus's apparent remorse. Others thought for months was too lenient, arguing that a regular person without resources would have received much harsher treatment. A smaller group felt that Marcus had already suffered enough through public humiliation and the destruction of his career. James was informed of the verdict by his commanding officer. He nodded quietly, feeling neither satisfaction nor disappointment. Justice had been served through the proper legal channels, and that was all that mattered to him. When asked by a military journalist for his reaction, James simply stated that he hoped Marcus would use this experience to become a better person, and that everyone deserved a chance at redemption. Marcus returned to jail to serve the remaining 10 weeks of his sentence. The routine continued, but something had shifted in him. He no longer spent his time dwelling on what he had lost. Instead, he thought about who he wanted to become. He read books from the prison library, not the business books he used to read, but philosophy, history, and memoirs of people who had overcome their own failures. Derek, his cellmate, noticed the change. They had real conversations now about life, mistakes, and second chances. Derek shared that he would be released soon and was terrified of making the same mistakes that had landed him in jail. Marcus listened and offered what little wisdom he had gained. The two men, from completely different worlds, had formed an unlikely friendship based on mutual recognition of their failures and hopes for redemption. Marcus received a letter one day that made him break down completely. It was from James. The guard had received Marcus's apology letter and had taken weeks to decide whether to respond. James wrote that he accepted Marcus's apology, but emphasized that acceptance didn't mean forgetting. He wrote about the importance of learning from mistakes and becoming someone worthy of the second chance Marcus was being given. The letter was firm but compassionate. It gave Marcus something he desperately needed, a sense that redemption was possible. The remaining weeks passed slowly but steadily. Marcus participated in every program the jail offered: anger management, substance abuse counseling, even though that wasn't his issue, and classes on financial literacy that he helped teach to other inmates who lacked his business knowledge. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was contributing something meaningful rather than just taking what he wanted. His parents visited several more times, and each visit was a little less painful than the last. They could see the change in their son, the return of qualities they thought wealth had erased. His father told him about setting up a small apartment for him when he returned home. It's nothing fancy, just a place to start rebuilding. His mother brought photos of family gatherings he had missed, reminding him of what really mattered in life. The morning of Marcus's release arrived with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had served as for months, and now faced the daunting task of rebuilding his life from the ruins of his own making. Prison officials processed his release paperwork, returned his personal belongings, and reminded him of his probation requirements. Within hours, he would be on a flight back to California, banned from returning to the country for a decade. A small crowd of reporters waited outside the jail, hoping to capture the moment of his release. Marcus's lawyer, Catherine, had arranged for him to exit through a side entrance to avoid the media circus. As Marcus stepped into the sunlight for the first time in months as a free man, he felt overwhelmed. The world seemed brighter, louder, and more intense than he remembered. His parents were waiting in a car nearby. His mother rushed to embrace him, holding him tight while crying. His father shook his hand firmly, looking him in the eyes with an expression that mixed love, disappointment, and hope. Emily was there too, standing back initially, but then stepping forward to hug her brother. No words were needed in that moment. They were a family, damaged but not broken, ready to begin healing. The flight back to California was surreal. Marcus wore simple clothes and kept his head down, hoping not to be recognized. A few passengers stared at him, clearly recognizing his face from the countless news stories, but no one approached him. He was grateful for the privacy. During the long flight, Marcus stared out the window and thought about everything that had happened. 4 months ago, He had been a successful businessman with the world at his feet. Now he was a convicted criminal, infamous worldwide, starting over with nothing. Returning home to California was humbling. His father drove him to the small apartment they had rented for him in a modest neighborhood. Nothing like the luxury high-rise where he had lived before. The apartment was furnished simply with second-hand furniture, a far cry from his designer pieces. But as Marcus walked through the space, he felt something he hadn't experienced in his old life: gratitude. The first weeks back were the hardest. Marcus had to report regularly to his probation officer. It's a no-nonsense woman named Linda Chen, who made it clear she had zero tolerance for violations. He had to find employment, which proved nearly impossible with his criminal record and infamous reputation. Every job application seemed to lead nowhere. Companies would interview him out of curiosity, but none wanted to take the risk of hiring someone so publicly disgraced. Marcus eventually found work at a construction company owned by one of his father's old friends. The job was physical labor, far removed from his previous life in tech. He spent his days carrying materials, cleaning job sites, and taking orders from supervisors half his age. His coworkers knew who he was. The viral video had ensured everyone knew his face. But they judged him on his work ethic rather than his past. Marcus showed up early, worked hard, and never complained. Slowly, he earned their respect. The online world hadn't forgotten him. His Wikipedia page was dominated by the assault incident. His old social media accounts, which he had deleted, were archived and analyzed in countless articles and videos. Whenever his name was searched, the first results were about the viral video. Marcus had to accept that this would be his legacy, at least for many years to come. The internet never forgot. But Marcus was determined to create a new story, even if it would never erase the old one. He started volunteering at a veterans center on weekends, helping with administrative tasks and fundraising. The director, a retired colonel, had been skeptical at first, but gave Marcus a chance after seeing genuine commitment. Working with veterans, hearing their stories of service and sacrifice, deepened Marcus's understanding of what he had disrespected that day at the palace. 6 months after his release, Marcus received an unexpected email. It was from a small nonprofit organization that worked to rehabilitate people after incarceration. They had been following his story and his efforts to rebuild his life. They wanted to know if he would be willing to speak to young people about the consequences of entitlement and the importance of respecting others. Marcus's first instinct was to refuse. He didn't want to exploit his mistakes for attention, but after talking with his parents and his probation officer, Marcus reconsidered. If sharing his story could prevent even one person from making similar mistakes, wouldn't that be worthwhile? He agreed to speak, with one condition: no payment. If he was going to share his story, it would be purely to help others, not to profit from his infamy. His first speaking engagement was at a high school in a wealthy suburb, the kind of place where students drove luxury cars and wore designer clothes. Marcus stood before a gymnasium full of teenagers and told them everything. He didn't sugarcoat his actions or make excuses. He showed them the viral video, making himself watch it again, despite how painful it was. He talked about how his success had poisoned him with arrogance, how he had treated people as inferior, and how one moment of violence had destroyed everything he had built. The students were captivated. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed moved by his honesty. During the question period, a young man asked Marcus if he had forgiven himself. Marcus paused, considering the question carefully. He answered that he was working on it, that forgiveness was a process, not a destination. He said he might never fully forgive himself, but he was committed to becoming someone worthy of a second chance. Sarah, his former business partner, reached out to him after hearing about his speaking engagements. They met for coffee in a neutral location, the first time they had seen each other since his arrest. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with hurt and unresolved feelings. Sarah told him honestly that she had been angry at him for destroying everything they had built together. But she also acknowledged that she had seen warning signs about his behavior and had ignored them because the business was successful. Marcus apologized, not just for the assault, but for all the times he had let his ego damage their partnership and friendship. He told Sarah he understood if she never wanted to speak to him again, but he was grateful she had given him the chance to apologize in person. Sarah listened, and when he finished, she said something that surprised him. She told him that watching him lose everything and then genuinely work to become better had been difficult, but also eye-opening. She saw more of the old Marcus now than she had in years. They didn't become close friends again. Too much had happened for that. But they agreed to stay in touch and support each other's growth. Sarah was rebuilding the business with new values and priorities. Marcus was rebuilding his life with humility and purpose. Both journeys were hard, but they were moving forward. A year after the incident, Marcus sat in his small apartment and reflected on everything that had changed. He had a modest job, a tiny savings account, and a criminal record. His social media presence was non-existent by choice. He had lost his wealth, his status, and his reputation. But he had gained something more valuable: self-awareness, humility, and genuine connections with people who saw him for who he was trying to become rather than who he had been. James, the guard Marcus had assaulted, had moved on with his life as well. He had been promoted and continued to serve with distinction. The incident was a footnote in his career, not its defining moment. He occasionally thought about Marcus and wondered if the man had truly changed, or if the remorse had been just for show. James hoped it was genuine. He believed in the possibility of redemption, even for those who had wronged him. The viral video still circulated online, coming back whenever someone wanted to discuss entitled tourist behavior or instant karma. Marcus couldn't control that. What he could control was his response to it. When people recognized him, which happened less frequently as time passed, he didn't hide or make excuses. He acknowledged his mistake, expressed genuine remorse, and tried to show through his actions that he had learned from the experience. Marcus started writing a book about his experience. Not to profit from it, but to create a comprehensive resource for young people about the dangers of privilege and entitlement. He donated the manuscript to the nonprofit organization he worked with, allowing them to use it however they felt would be most helpful. The book was published as a free online resource and had been downloaded over 100,000 times by parents, teachers, and young people themselves. His relationship with his family slowly healed. Sunday dinners became a regular occurrence, something Marcus had been too busy for in his previous life. He watched his sister graduate nursing school and helped her move into her first apartment. He spent time with his aging parents, helping them with tasks around their house and simply being present in their lives. These small, ordinary moments meant more to Marcus than all his previous success ever had. Derek, his former cellmate, had successfully rebuilt his life too. They stayed in touch, meeting once a month for coffee to check in on each other. Derek had found steady work and was supporting his family again. The two men formed an accountability partnership, keeping each other honest about their progress and their setbacks. Their friendship was born from mutual failure, but it had grown into something genuinely meaningful. 2 years after the incident, Marcus received a letter that left him speechless. It was from James. The guard wrote that he had followed Marcus's journey from a distance and had seen the speaking engagements, the volunteer work, and the consistent efforts to become better. James wrote that he believed Marcus's remorse was genuine and that he respected the difficult work of true redemption. He ended the letter by saying he held no ill will and wished Marcus well in his continued growth. Marcus read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. He had never expected forgiveness from James, had never felt he deserved it. But this acknowledgement that his efforts were recognized, that his change was seen as authentic, meant everything. He wrote back, thanking James for his grace and promising to continue working to be worthy of the second chance he had been given. The world moved on, as it always does. New viral videos captured public attention. Other scandals emerged and faded. Marcus Chen's name appeared less frequently in searches and discussions. He was becoming what he had once feared most: ordinary. But now, he understood that ordinary was extraordinary. Living with integrity, treating people with respect, contributing positively to his community, these were the things that actually mattered. On the 3rd anniversary of the incident, Marcus stood before a group of college students and told his story once more. After he finished, A young woman raised her hand and asked if he thought karma was real. Marcus smiled, thinking about the question carefully. He told her that karma wasn't some mystical force that magically punished bad behavior. Rather, it was the natural consequence of our actions rippling through our lives and the lives of others. His punch had created ripples that destroyed his old life. But his efforts to change had created new ripples that were slowly building something better. That night, Marcus returned to his small apartment and looked at the framed letter from James hanging on his wall. Below it was a photo from his recent volunteer work at the Veterans Center, surrounded by people he had come to respect deeply. Next to that was a picture of his family at his sister's graduation, everyone smiling genuinely. These were his treasures now, not material wealth or social media followers, but evidence of genuine human connection and positive impact. Marcus knew he would never escape his past completely. The viral video would exist forever, a permanent reminder of his worst moment. But he had learned to carry that weight differently. It wasn't a burden that crushed him anymore, but rather a reminder of how far he had come and how important it was to never return to the person he had been. As he prepared for bed that night, Marcus thought about the journey from that terrible day at the palace to this quiet evening in his modest apartment. Karma had indeed caught up with him, swift and devastating. But redemption, he had learned, was slower and harder. It required consistent effort, genuine change, and acceptance that you might never fully outrun your mistakes. The key was to stop running and start building something better. That was the real lesson his viral moment had taught him, and it was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life.